Hey everybody, welcome on our channel. In this video we are gonna see, what if Naruto unleashed his powers in Star Wars? Part 2. If you are new on the channel, don't forget to subscribe our channel and like the video too. So without wasting any more time, let's start the story. The group made their way back to where the transport ship was with Ahsoka talking to Naruto while the adults just listened in. As they made their way, there was another set of individuals following them deep within the woods. And not many of the vehicles touched ground. About every vehicle now in all Republic space either float or fly. Naruto couldn't help but have an expression of awe. Damn, I know I saw the ship you guys came in, but I didn't think all of the vehicles were like that. Think I can get one myself. Anakin looked over his shoulder with a smile on his face. I think it is better you learn how to use some of the simple things we know before you get to the more complicated things. Naruto looked grumpily at the man. He humped as he crossed his arms. Just watch me. I'll catch up with all of you and be better in no time. Obi-Wan was the next one to speak. You are very ambitious to believe you can catch up so quickly. Naruto just looked at him with a smirk. I have my ways. The Jedi were interested in how he thought he would catch up, but it would have to wait as they had arrived at the landing site. Brax and Cody saw them arrive and both stood at attention as they saluted. Sir. Obi-Wan nodded to them as he asked. Is everything ready for our departure? Cody nodded. Yes sir, everything is ready to go. We also alerted the starship to get ready with the coordinates for Coruscant. Brax looked at the rest of the group and saw Naruto standing with them. I see that our new friend is coming with us. Glad to have you join us. Naruto smiled at the clone. I get to be the first shinobi in space. No way am I passing that up. Training in their force is just a bonus. Ahsoka rolled her eyes as she shoulder bumped him. Yeah, right. On the way here you asked me a bunch of things I knew about it before we got to the technology. Naruto rubbed the back of his head as he chuckled sheepishly. Anakin smiled as he saw that her Padawan was getting along with Naruto, which wasn't that surprising. He had also grown to like the kid in the small amount of time they had been here. Obi-Wan turned his head towards the fallen Jedi starfighter. Will we be able to take that with us? Everyone followed his gaze before Cody sighed and shook his head. Unfortunately not sir. I contacted the cruiser and they told me that they didn't have any carriers on board. The best we can do is inform the kids' village to come to pick it up and hold on to it till we can get a way to bring it back. Obi-Wan crossed his arms. That is unfortunate. He turned his gaze to Ahsoka who looked down in a little guilt. If only the pilot had a softer landing. Anakin put his hands on his hips. Hey, she walked away from it, didn't she? Any landing you walk away from is a good one. Yes, but one you can return to is much better. Ahsoka was about to thank her master for trying to defend her till she noticed that the blonde wasn't with them. She looked back towards the crashed ship and saw him walking towards it. Naruto, what are you doing? Naruto raised a finger to tell her to wait for a second as he walked around the ship while keeping his eye on it. He circled the craft twice before he stood at it. Sighed. Okay. The others waited to see what Naruto was going to do and they watched him reach into the pouch he had on his hip before pulling out a scroll. They saw him bring the scroll in front of him and out of sight before he suddenly dropped a backpack on the ground. Anakin tilted his head as he asked no one in particular. Where did the bag come from? They continued to watch as Naruto rummaged through the bag, mumbling something about they better have put it in here before he pulled out another scroll and looked at it. He smiled and stood back up, facing away from them, and once again he had something in his hands he didn't before. This time it was a large scroll that they knew he did not have before. As they watched him lay the large scroll on the ground, Ahsoka walked forward to ask him. What are you doing? Naruto looked over his shoulder and smirked at her. Just wait. He stood up and brought his hands up in a familiar sign. Shadow clone jutsu. Instantly, 30 clones appeared at his side before he walked toward the starfighter. The others watched in silence, still wondering what he was doing, till they saw all of them encircle the ship and began to slowly lift it, with slight difficulty shown on each of their faces. The original Naruto grunted as he helped his clones to lift the ship. This is heavy, but not as heavy as I thought it would be. The others were impressed that he was able to lift the ship by himself, in a manner of speaking. Ahsoka was impressed by the amount of strength he was showing. Even if there were 30 of them, the ship was still heavy. She looked to her master and whispered to him. Shouldn't we help him? Anakin smirked at her as he whispered. Nah, let him have this moment, Snips. And besides, I'm curious to see what he plans on doing. Naruto moved the ship over the scroll. The clones positioned it over the scroll as one of them grunted. Said, boss. Naruto let go of the edge that he was on before going under the ship to the scroll he laid on the ground. He placed his hand on the scroll and channeled chakra into it. The ones that had been watching went wide-eyed as they just saw the Jedi starfighter disappear in a puff of smoke. They all stared as the other clones disappeared and the original rolled up a scroll before he made it disappear in a smaller scroll, which he put in his back before he made that disappear into another scroll which he put in his pouch. Naruto smiled as he walked back to the others but stopped and looked confused at the look of awe the others had. What? Rex shook his head before he stepped forward. Kid, what did you do to the ship? Naruto tilted his head for a second before he remembered that they wouldn't have known about it. Oh, I sealed it away in the scroll. Since you guys said that you didn't have a way to bring it with us, I chose to seal it away in a scroll so you guys wouldn't have an issue with it. The rest of them were stunned at the fact that he had just put the ship away for easy travel. One of the clone troopers was the one that snapped out of his thoughts. Can we learn how to do that? Some of the other clones chuckled at that and this shook the rest of them out of it. Anakin couldn't help but mumble to himself. That could have saved me all the trouble of leaving some of my ships behind. Obi-Wan looked at him as he spoke. We are able to replace them, you know. Yeah, but imagine the amount we could have saved if I could just fix the thing. Naruto thought about what Anakin just said and thought about asking him to teach him what he could about these ships. But his curious amusement dropped before he spoke. Guys, we have company, and it's not the good kind. He pulled out a kunai and spun around to look at the woods. Out of the trees came a group of shinobi that surrounded the transport ship, each of them pulling out kunai. The GD and clones grew serious as they looked around. Seeing the weapons, Anakin looked at Naruto. Friends of yours? Naruto's eyes shifted to the surrounding shinobi. Oh yeah, the best of friends. They must have wanted to give me a happy farewell. The amount of sarcasm pouring out of his mouth told the others that he knew who they were and was tired of them. One of the shinobi, which they guessed to be the leader, lifted his hand as if expecting something and spoke. Jinchuriki of Konoha, hand over the scroll, and you along with the rest here are to surrender to us. Ahsoka stepped next to Naruto and asked him. Okay, so who are these guys? Naruto didn't need to look at them to know who they were, since this wasn't the first time he had to deal with them. They're cold rude. They are a bunch of shinobi that work for someone that has a high position in my village and has been trying to get his hands on me for a while since he wants to turn me into a mindless slave. Ahsoka raised an eyebrow. Why? Sorry, but can't tell you. He looked around at the shinobi before he loosened his fingers around his kunai as he spoke to the Gideon clones. Hope you guys are good at fighting blind and don't hold back. Out of his fingers came a small pellet that once it hit the ground, exploded in a smokescreen that covered up the GD. The clones began to open fire at the shinobi they could catch by surprise and took them down. The GD ducked as a flurry of kunai flew over their head and they lit their lightsaber to cut the rest of them out of the air before they ran towards them. Naruto did a familiar hand sign and summoned hundreds of clones before they ran at the enemy shinobi. While most of the clones attacked the root shinobi, several of them grabbed the clones and brought them into the ship. One of the shadow clones put Cody down and spoke. Start this thing and get us out of here. Cody was surprised since he was in the middle of firing at some of the enemies before he found himself back inside. Regaining his thoughts, he chose to go with it and moved to the pilot seat and began the startup sequence. The shadow clone looked up at the sound and dispelled himself. Naruto got the memories as he jumped back from a fireball jutsu. Time to leave. He made 3 more clones and moved towards the ship. Anakin, Obi-Wan and Ahsoka were jumping out of the way of elemental attacks. Fire, earth, wind and water-based attacks. Anakin brought his hand up and used force push to send the fireball away from him and at another group of shinobi. The GD then felt something wrap around their waist and pulled back towards the ship. In an instant, they found themselves back on the ship and Naruto's above them. The original jumped in and shouted out. Get us out of here. Cody nodded as he started to lift the ship off the ground. Rex was blasting at some incoming shinobi that were starting to learn to avoid the blaster fire. Someone get on the turrets. The pair of clones that haven't gotten on the ship yet redirected themselves to the turrets and jumped into the turrets beeped before they turned them on and began to shift it to fire at them. The ship lifted off the ground with all the clones on board before gaining altitude. The root shinobi would have jumped after it or attacked it to bring it down if it weren't for the streams of laser fire that blasted at them. Naruto glared at the root shinobi as they gained altitude. I should have figured he would have tried something like this. The bastard needs to get it through his head that I don't belong to him. I'm not someone who will be a slave to anyone. Anakin closed the ship door as they were leaving the planet soon. He let out a sigh before he turned to Naruto. So what was all that about? Naruto let out a defeated sigh before he dropped to the ground. Sorry about that. There is someone in the village that has had his eye on me for years and wanted to take me into his organization. The problem is that the way he wants me is mindless and listens only to him. He sees himself as the rightful ruler of Konoha and wants to take over the rest of the villages. Problem is that he has no qualms about killing anyone that might get in his way instead of looking for peaceful ways to do things. It is why Tsunade has been stripping him of his power over time, but he has made sure that a bunch of things doesn't lead to him, and he is so tangled in a bunch of things that it is taking far longer than she would have liked. He placed his hands on the ground as he felt a little disoriented before continuing. But after learning about this, he would be lucky if Tsunade doesn't kill him. Obi-Wan sighed as he asked. How would she know? We were far away from your village. Naruto looked at him with a cheeky smile. I sent one of my clones back to the village to inform Tsunade about the attack. She will know about it the second my clone drops the mask he swiped onto the desk. Everyone turned their heads as they heard R2 beep urgently and saw that one of the clones was laying on the ground with a kunai in his chest. Naruto got to his feet and moved over to him. Crap. You okay? The clone grunted as he looked down at the kunai. Not a good question, kid. Naruto winced as he realized how stupid the question was. Sorry. The meta clone moved over to the other side of the clone and looked at the kunai. We have to get the thing out of your chest and quickly remove the armor in order to patch you up. We don't know how deep it is, but we should be glad that it is the center of your chest. If it hit anything important we might not be able to save you. Naruto snapped his finger before he reached into his weapons pouch and pulled out his kunai. All kunai we use are exactly like this one. Sure, there are a few specially made ones, but this is the most common one. The medic looked at the kunai in the kid's hand before looking at the one in the clone's chest. Okay, with how thin the armor is and the length of the kunai, you should be fine. But we should still get it out of you and patch you up. Another pair of clones unclipped the latch of the armor to get it ready to remove. The medic grabbed the kunai and looked at his injured brethren. Ready? He nodded as he grit his teeth. In one quick motion, the kunai was yanked out of him and the armor was pulled off him and the medic began to work on the injury. This could have been bad, but thankfully we got out of there before it got worse. The other clones there looked at Naruto and nodded to him. Thanks, kid. Naruto sheepishly rubbed his head. It was nothing. I should actually apologize since it was kinda my fault. Ahsoka patted his shoulder. Hey, it isn't your fault. You helped us out, not only with the GD starfighter, but also in the fight. That smokescreen was really helpful, and you were able to get all the clones and put them on the ship so that we could leave. Sure, he may have been after you, but we can't blame you for it. Anakin nodded. I gotta say, it is a good thing for you that we take you away from such a dangerous person in your own village. Obi-Wan raised an eyebrow at him. You do realize the conflict we have ourselves. Naruto looked at them and could tell this was something that he should know. What conflict? The adults looked at each other before sighing with the younger of the two speaking. We'll tell you when we get to the starship. Naruto gave him a critical look before he shrugged. 500 Ryo says we just got into a bigger problem than we originally thought. No way in hell am I taking that. Just make sure that you know what we are getting into. Getting fucked around is not something we need to bring with us. Was Yomi's response as he crossed his arms and leaned on the bar of the QP cage. Naruto gave a mental nod as he leaned on the side of the ship. Alright, but if I am getting into something, I would like to know what it is before it slaps me in the face. He groaned as he felt woozy. And why the hell do I feel so dizzy? Ugh. Back in Konoha. Tsunade was back in her office, drinking some sake as she thought about the departing blonde. She had seen the ship leave from the roof of the Hokage Tower and couldn't help but smile at the space adventure. She leaned back in her chair as she thought about how things would be different now with him gone and what would come from his return. She heard the door burst open and she spun in her chair to see Naruto leaning on his knees and panting. Didn't expect him to return this quickly. Was her mental joke before she got back to business. Gaki, what are you doing here? I thought you already left. Naruto finally caught his breath before he got up. I did. Boss sent me here since we had trouble while leaving. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an animal mask before putting it on the desk. Now, most would think that it belongs to one of the Anbu that Naruto had pranked before, but the fact that it did not have any red marking on it told Tsunade who this belonged to. The chair handles of the chair exploded as Tsunade gripped them with her super strength. She unleashed so much Kai that everyone in the building stopped breathing. She slowly raised her gaze from the mask to the clone and whispered. Safe travels, Naruto. The clone dispelled, and even it didn't know if it was dispelling itself or the Kai had killed it. Tsunade got up from her chair and leveled out her Kai as she gently pressed the intercom button. Call in every Jonin and Anbu and send them to my office, now. Why eyes, lad ma'am. Tsunade stood there and waited for all of her high-ranking shinobi to come as she was going to murder someone who she had wanted to get rid of for some time. I no longer care if we can't pin anything on you. To hell with the consequences. Danzo dies today. Danzo had been a thorn in Konoha's side for too long. It was Danzo that had made many enemies for Konoha, did nothing during the Suna invasion, and had given Orochimaru several key details that allowed the Serpent access to their village secrets. Nothing could be linked to the old Warhawk, only speculations and hints. But a majority of the shinobi knew that Danzo was the cause of many of the problems that happened to Konoha. Even investigations about the man brought up some interesting findings. But his recent actions have really put a target on his head. Namely his constant attempts to acquire Naruto. From political meetings, rescues from mob attacks when the boy was younger, and even Root trying to kidnap him during certain events. Tsunade will nail him to the ground and crush his head with her foot at the end of the day, cause she is sick of him. Once she heard the arrival of her shinobi, she turned to them and looked at them. We have a parasite in Konoha and it's time we remove it. The shinobi in her office stood at attention and awaited their orders. Starship. Naruto was doing his best to follow the GD as they were making their way to the command center. But he kept looking around in awe as they continued through the ship. He did this the second he walked off the transport ship and he kept stumbling on his feet as he spun around to see everything that was around him. Ahsoka kept having to pull him in a direction so he doesn't run into a wall. Would you stop gawking? You nearly tripped on R2 for the 5th time in the last 7 minutes. Naruto finally took his eyes off the area around him as he looked at her. Sorry, but all of this is much better than anything we could come up with in manga. The adults chuckled at this, with Obi-Wan looking over his shoulder. Remember, Ahsoka, this is all new to him. It only makes sense that he would be surprised about what we know is common. Ahsoka sighed in defeat. Yes, Master Kenobi. Anakin smiled at his Padawan. Don't worry, Snips, he'll get used to it and soon you won't have to drag him like a lost lava merkid. Actual name of the animal, I think. They made it to the command center and one of the admirals walked up to them. Good to see you back, sir, and, Ahsoka, glad to see you're well. Sorry for the trouble. He nodded before noticing the newcomer. And this is? Naruto waved at the man with his foxy smile. Hi, I'm Naruto Uzumaki. Obi-Wan looked at the admiral. He is a potential addition to our GD order. We will be taking him to our council to discuss his potential acceptance. Nodding, the admiral got back to business. Well, most of the fleet is waiting for the command to head back to Coruscant, with a few having already been sent ahead. From where we are, it could take us over a week. Obi-Wan sighed. That is quite a distance. Best we get the journey started. We will already arrive later than we thought. Inform the other ships that we are heading back. Yes, sir. He moved over to the side to speak with the other ships. Anakin was the next to talk. A week, huh? That gives us some time to get Naruto up to speed on what he might become part of. Naruto nodded as he had a feeling that despite the chance to learn something new, there would be some different issues he would have to deal with. But as he was about to say something, he saw out the window and couldn't help but walk closer to it and look at the expanse of space. I'm really in space. He spoke in a tone of awe. I've become the first shinobi to go into space. Awesome. Unseen by the blonde, everyone couldn't help but find it amusing to see the sheer awe on his face. They had seen space and traveled through it so much that they had forgotten that in the grand scheme of things, it is something to see. One of the clones on one of the consoles spoke up. Sir, we are ready to jump to hyperspace. Obi-Wan nodded. Then let us be off. The clone nodded before pushing the lever to send it to hyperspace. Naruto watched as the stars he was just looking at began to extend till he saw blue and black passing walls. He suddenly felt woozy and stumbled to his feet. Oh, man. What the hell? Why does it feel like we are wobbling? Ahsoka tilted her head as she asked. You can feel the ship moving. Is that what is going on? He covered his mouth and held back as he took a deep breath. Feels so weird. Ahsoka moved toward him and helped him stay on his feet. How can you feel us going into hyperspace? I'll tell you when I figure out what the hell that is. He was able to get back on somewhat steady feet and nodded his thanks to her. He then walked over to the older GD. Okay, so what is the conflict you talked about before? The two nodded to each other with Obi-Wan choosing to speak. We are in the middle of a galactic war between the Republic and the Separatists. I'm Skip, GD Temple. GD Master Yoda was meditating in his room as a way to pass the time on such a calm day. His eyes then opened as he felt something in the Force. He raised his head and looked out the window. Arrive, they have. Strong in the Force this new one is. He got up from his seat and grabbed his cane before making his way to where he could meet them. Strange. More to this one, I sense. Naruto. Shock and awe would be the biggest understatement in the whole galaxy in Naruto's mind. The first shock was when the planet came into view and he was told that the whole thing is one big city. He had no idea how to handle that kind of information. The next was when they entered the planet and all the massive structures and flying vehicles that took up the whole view. Sure, Naruto didn't fully like it since he was so used to seeing trees and wildlife, but he had to keep telling himself that this wasn't his planet. Which was still something he didn't know he would ever say in his life. Next were all the droids he could see. So many different droids in different shapes and sizes. He had his face pressed against the window of the shuttle they used to move from the landing bay to another building. Despite his awe, his mind was still full of the details he got from his time on the ship. The Clone Wars. He was just put into the position of joining a war far bigger than what could be seen from his planet's own wars. Maybe not as explosive or grand in the ground fights, but since their battles took to space as well, it was far larger. He was informed that he might not be part of the war since he will spend a good amount of time studying and training. He knew his luck. There was no way that he would not be left on the sidelines when he could help. He just needed to catch up as fast as possible, and he had a trick for that. The speed of it all hinges on how much information there was that he needed. Fighting was something he already knew. He had spent the week on the ship learning some of the information that was available on the ship's computers, but he knew that there was much more he would need to learn, and he couldn't use his trick on the ship since there was only one computer allowed to him. Once they were off the shuttle, Naruto felt the need to ask. So, where are we going? Are we meeting with the GD Council? He still had an issue with the word council since back home there. He rubbed his forehead as it was bare of his headband. One thing that Anakin told him he should do is put it away, as one of the things about the GD is that they do not allow attachment to things. He was told the GD code, and that was another set of issues he had. The GD code was a set of rules that governed the behavior of the GD order. It taught its followers to not give in to feelings of anger toward other lifeforms, which would help them resist fear and prevent them from falling to the dark side of the Force. They are to avoid attachment, so not to feel any negative emotions and the possibility of losing them or feel jealous of others. Naruto felt that he needed to learn more about the code since he did not like the idea that he would have to be close to being a puppet to an order that is not his life. It almost sounded like a religious group to him. He needed to learn more about it since, as a shinobi, he needed to find if there was a loophole he could exploit. He had done it before, and if he was joining this group, he would do it again. Anakin shook his head. We will after this. We have to report to the Chancellor. He has a good standing on many political aspects and has the ear of the GD Council. If we ask him nicely, he might put in a word for you. Naruto nodded as he looked around at the decor of the building, as he had a mental issue. You guys deep enough? He mentally asked both of his tenants, as he was told that sometimes the GD could sense the dark side of the Force, and since he was said to have the Force and how negativity was seen as a very bad thing, he, Yami, and Kurama agreed that the Biju and the dark side of Naruto would bury themselves as deep in his mind as they could. They didn't know how well the Four Senses are, but they weren't going to take any risks. They would test their limits much later. For a split second, he got a confirmation from Kurama, since Yami is more connected to Naruto's negativity. They were going to play this game very close to the chest. The group made it to a large room that had a window that spanned the whole wall behind an old man that was sitting at a very fancy-looking table. Naruto couldn't help but think that it was very familiar. Old man in a fancy office with a large window behind him. But that was the only familiarity he had with this scene. Ah, Anakin, Obi-Wan, Ahsoka, it is good to see you after your extended absence. He looked at the three GD before his eyes shifted to the newcomer. And who is this? Obi-Wan looked at the boy standing to his right and gestured to the elderly man. Naruto, this is Chancellor Palpatine, a very high-standing political figure to the Republic. He then looked at Palpatine and gestured to the boy. And this is Naruto Uzumaki. We had discovered him during our little trip, and I could sense him to be a Force potential. We brought him along with us as I felt that he could be a welcome addition to our group. Palpatine looked at the boy before he gained a look of confusion. At this age. Forgive me if I am mistaken, but I was under the impression that they must be younger in order to join your order. Obi-Wan nodded. That is normally the case, but a master can take up an older one as an apprentice. I was planning on taking him as my own Padawan once we discuss things with the council. Though there may be someone more capable than myself, we should focus on getting him acclimated into our order. Palpatine nodded as he ran the thought through his head. Naruto Uzumaki, such an interesting name. I am uncertain of which system that name may originate from. He then looked at the boy's attire and could not place their design either. As well as the interesting attire he wears. Which system does he come from? Anakin was about to answer, but he was beaten to it by the very blonde. Naruto raised his arms to the side in front of Obi-Wan, but was glad that Anakin saw his gesture. He stared hard at the old man as he spoke. I would like it if my home planet is unknown to anyone. So if you don't mind, let's not bring it into this. I read about the war and I don't want it anywhere close to home. Palpatine tilted his head a bit as he asked. Would it not be beneficial to bring them into the Republic? It would put your home under the banner of the Republic and could aid in any potential encounters they may face. No. My home has a bunch of problems already, it doesn't need a galactic war to add to it. Palpatine sat down and nodded. Very well, though I would recommend your time here to be spent considering the offer. Naruto nodded. I'll consider it. Was his terse response. He kept his face neutral and relaxed his body, but kept his legs tense. Ahsoka looked at him oddly but said nothing. Obi-Wan spoke up after a second after the silence. Well, now that we have spoken about the Naruto, I would like to ask if there is anything we need to know from your end. Naruto took a few steps back as the adults began to talk about stuff he had no chance of understanding. Though he could figure that they were talking about someone that is very much disliked or a criminal that they want to catch. Someone by the name Grievous. After a few minutes, it looked like the conversation was ending, and Naruto moved a bit closer. If there are any problems that come from these encounters, I will be sure to inform the GD of the details. It is best we find a way to capture Grievous and Count Dooku as soon as possible. The sooner they are apprehended, the sooner we can end this war. Palpatine looked at the newcomer and smiled. And I hope you show promise in your training. Naruto nodded. I'm sure that there are others that will be better than me, but I won't fall behind just because I am coming into the order late. If I have to work harder to catch up, I will. Palpatine nodded. A good mindset. I expect good things from the one that Obi-Wan and Anakin have gained an interest in. The GD bowed and Naruto did the same. After a second, Obi-Wan spoke. By your leave, Chancellor, we must be on our way. Palpatine nodded. Do not let me hold you up. He then looked at Anakin with a smile. Anakin, we can speak later on. Anakin smiled. Chancellor. With that, the four left the Chancellor's office. Palpatine sat back in his chair with a thoughtful expression. Interesting. The four were now in a shuttle that was on its way to the GD temple. Naruto was slowly getting used to the motion of the mechanical transports and was sitting in his seat with a serious expression on his face. What's got under your skin? Naruto looked to his left to see Ahsoka looking at him with a curious expression. What? Ahsoka rolled her eyes as she repeated. What's bugging you? Before we arrived at the Chancellor's office you were in awe of everything around you, but now, you look like Anakin when he was in a very tense meeting about something. Hey, I do not look like that when I do. Anakin crossed his arms and looked to the side. After a second he looked to his master. Do I? Obi-Wan chuckled at the question. At times, you do. Naruto shook his head as he answered. I'm still amazed by all the stuff that is around me, but my mind is on the guy we just met. Something about him feels off. Anakin picked up on this and asked. What do you mean? Naruto shrugged his shoulders. I don't know. But when we entered the room, my gut was telling me that I should be wary of him, to not trust him. The older GD raised their eyebrows at that as they did not see what the issue about the Chancellor was. Ahsoka was in the same boat but asked something related to it. Is that why you didn't want to tell him where your planet was? Naruto nodded. Yeah, and what I told him was something I came up with on the fly, but I think it would be better if no one knows where to find it. You guys found my planet on accident, I don't want someone finding it on purpose, especially if you guys are in the middle of a war. Ahsoka leaned back in her seat as she brought something up. Well, that is going to be hard. The records and coordinates of your planet are now in the HIPS logs. Anyone can find it on there if they look up the records. Naruto sat up straighter at that. Is there any way to get rid of them? Anakin was the one to speak up next. Yeah. It will take a while before the records are put into the archives, but till then it stays in the computer. But I don't think it is a good idea to try and please get rid of them. Obi-Wan was next to speak. Naruto, if we delete it from the records, you may never find it again. As you said, we found it by accident, and once the records are wiped, there will be no way to go back. Better for me to be stuck with you guys and never go back than go back and find war at my doorstep. The GD looked at each other before Anakin said. I'll see if I can have Rex wipe it. Naruto sighed as he relaxed in his seat. Thanks. Once he knew that the way back home would be out of reach for anyone, he calmed down. Sure, it also meant that he would not know how to get back, but he had seen some images of the war. He didn't want that to go to his home. We are arriving at the GD temple. Naruto yelped in shock before he looked at the droid piloting the shuttle. I forgot about there being a droid on board. R2 beeps at him in indignation at being forgotten about. Naruto looked at the astro droid and despite not understanding him, he understood his mistake and sheepishly rubbed his head. Sorry, R2, had a lot on my mind. Hearing the droid beep and turn away, he guessed that the droid was still mad at him. The first thing that Naruto thought about the GD temple was, wow. The temple itself had an elegant design and was futuristic while also seeming old school. One thing he noticed was the other what he assumed were GD, since they had clothing much like Obi-Wan and Anakin. The last thing that clued him in on that was the fact that the adults also had lightsabers, each of them being different in design. As he looked at everyone, he couldn't help but ask. Hey, do I get one of those? Anakin laughed at this question as he looked at the boy. Already thinking of getting one? Well, it's just that I see all the other adults having one on their belt. Not to mention you guys. He pointed at the lightsaber that they had. And I have to admit. It was cool when I used hers. Ahsoka groaned at the reminder. Anakin chuckled before he shook his head. I don't think we are ever going to let you live this down, Snips. But you won't be getting one anytime soon. There are a lot of things you need to learn before you construct your own. Naruto paused for a second before he looked at him in shock. Wait, you build them yourselves? Yep. Wow. Something to look forward to. As they continued to walk through the temple, Naruto felt something up ahead. He looked down the hall and saw a small green creature standing in the center of the corridor, almost as if waiting for them. As they got closer, Obi-Wan greeted him. Master Yoda, we did not expect you to wait for us out here. Yoda nodded with a smile on his face. Sensed you, I did. And new arrival, I wished to meet. He looked at Naruto and could see the look of stunned shock on the boy's face, which caused him to chuckle. Surprised, Naruto sheepishly rubbed the back of his head as he mumbled out. Sorry, I'm not used to seeing aliens. Ahsoka looked at him with an exasperated sigh. Tigrita, right here. Naruto looked at her with a deadpan. A what? Anakin spoke up for her. It's the name of her race. And I am surprised that you haven't noticed the other races all around you. Naruto looked around at the adults he had noticed were Jedi and actually looked at the heads instead of the clothing. There were a few people that looked like humans, but there were a bunch of others that were clearly aliens of so many different races. How did I not notice that? He kinda understood the reason as to why, since his training had told him that he should look for potential hiding spots for concealed weapons and such. This just caused Ahsoka to drop her head in her hand. When she heard chuckling from Yoda, her head bolted up and she looked apologetic. Sorry Master Yoda. Child. Moments like these, good to have. He then looked to the boy. Welcome, young one. Heard of you, I have. Wish to speak with you, alone. Naruto was a little surprised that he wanted to talk to him alone. Looking at the others he asked. He saw that they were not surprised about it and figured that they expected this. Okay, I don't mind. Despite his last encounter with an elderly person, this one was much different. This Yoda gave off the impression Hiruzen used to give. The wise old man that you go to when you need advice. Much different from the Chancellor. Yoda nodded as he gestured for the boy to follow. Come, we talk in private. Naruto took a few steps before looking back. I'll see you guys later. He wanted it to come out as a statement, but it came out more as a question. Obi-Wan smiled and nodded. Oh, trust me, you'll be seeing us a lot if all goes well. Naruto nodded as he moved to follow the older Jedi. As the two walked, Yoda continued to look over his shoulder at the boy and could not help but smile at the sight. Naruto followed Yoda as best he could, but as they passed several areas he kept pausing to look at them in our interest. At times, Naruto would move to the side to look at something in the temple, only to catch up after a second. Yoda could not help but find it refreshing to see someone act like this. And he could tell it isn't because of being in the Jedi temple, it is just at the small things such as the species of one of the Jedi and some of the small bits of technology they use. He chuckled when he saw the boy notice that he was caught looking at things. He just continued to walk through the temple to one of the rooms that can be used for small meetings. The two were now in the room that they could discuss in private, with both sitting on a cushioned seat each. Naruto still looked around the room at the design and could not help but like it. He shook his head in order to look at the smaller being and figured he could look at it later. So what did you want to talk about? Was his nervous question. Yoda smiled as he pointed at the boy. Wished to know the young one Obi-Wan found. Strange for him to request a Padawan so soon after Skywalker receives his own. Naruto shrugged his shoulders at this, since he didn't know why Obi-Wan would take him in. He said that he could sense that I could use the Force, and while talking about me to Anakin, he said that I reminded him of Anakin when he was younger, but other than that, I don't know. Understandable. Much potential I sense in you, but more to you, there is. Heavy is the weight on your shoulders. Much strife in your life. Much pain. Naruto was startled that Yoda could sense that about him. He figured that lying would not be the best thing to do in front of someone of importance in the Jedi Order. He nodded as he began. I've had many problems back home that I wasn't the most liked when I was younger and had the scorn of many there. It hurt when I remember it, but I did my best to not let any of the hatred they had for me bother me. Yoda nodded. Wise to not give in to such. Path to the dark side these are. Naruto was confused about the term and decided to ask. Dark side. Manifestation of negative emotions. The dark side is corruption of self brought by fear. Naruto could see that the word fear was something Yoda keyed on. Why fear? Yoda took a deep breath as he had said this many times, and it is still the best way to explain it. Fear leads to anger, anger leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. Naruto shivered at the idea. I didn't expect that. Fear of loss can be a powerful force against you. Anger at the one that caused the loss will lead to hatred of it. Hatred leads to revenge and care not for those in your way. Tell me, young one, what do you fear? Naruto looked up and thought as he tried to think of what he feared. I never thought about what I could fear. Fear of loss. Naruto looked back down at him and could see a look of understanding on Yoda's face. Fear of losing oneself, you have. All that makes you who you are. Afraid that you will not be as you were when gone from everything you know. Naruto could see that this was true. He did fear losing himself and becoming something that he wasn't. Let this fear go, we can teach you. Seeing the look of shock he smiled and continued. Let go of fear, we must do. Letting go of what you hold dear you must, lest the fear consume you. Naruto looked down as he thought about doing what Yoda had said. I don't know if I can. Yoda nodded. Difficult this is, but help you we can. Naruto looked up at Yoda and nodded. This isn't something that I thought that I would have to do, but the idea of losing myself to the dark side isn't something that I want. If you can teach me, I am willing to learn. Yoda nodded. Much to learn you have. Teach you we will. He got up from his seat and gestured for Naruto to follow. Come, meet with others we must. Naruto nodded as he followed the GD master while thinking about what he learned. Manifestation of negative emotions, huh? Interesting way to put it, eh, Yami? Deep in Naruto's mindscape behind the seal of the QB, Yami heard the faint whisper of his light side's thoughts. Very interesting indeed, Naruto. He looked up at the QB and smirked. So far, it looks like they can't sense us. Kurama nodded. Not sure if it is because we are so far deep or the seal is blocking them, but I think we are going to find it very interesting here. Yami nodded. And Naruto won't have to worry about the dark side since he already has one and I'm in no hurry to cause suffering. I don't really care about these guys. Let's wait and see if there is something different about this force. Then we can see if you will become what these GD are against. Can't wait. Naruto and Yoda had met up with Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Ahsoka with the elder GD going off on his own, telling them that he will get the GD Council to gather to meet with Naruto and hear his story. During the wait, Naruto had asked where would be the best place to learn more about the language he saw around him. He was taught a bit of it on the ship thanks to one of the clones, and it was very helpful, but he could barely be seen as being on the child level of the language. This was something he had to rectify before he got started on catching up. He was told that he could find everything he needed in the library, including simple child materials. Ahsoka could not help but chuckle at this and said that she would never let this go. He was shown where the library was, but he didn't get the chance to actually go in since they needed to be ready when they were called by the GD Council. It was a few minutes after that they got the call and they made their way towards it. On the way, Naruto kept checking himself to make sure he was at least presentable. Sure, he could care less about the shinobi and civilian council back at home since as a shinobi, many of the times the one called would look scuffed up and bandaged up from mission, training, or tour. Naruto would go in his pajamas if he wanted since the civilian council was nothing but bigots who only cared about their own pockets and for some reason thought themselves the higher power in a shinobi village. It was always the ire of the shinobi council to listen to the complaints that usually had to do with him. Thankfully the shinobi council understood his situation and had no ill will towards him, and the clan heads had to discipline many of their clan members when many got out of hand. But the GD council is another matter. They are a group of people that he doesn't know and from what he learned are high in the political entanglements of the galaxy. He was glad that his black Anbu pants didn't have any cuts or dirt on them, his burnt orange sash was one of the new ones, so it wasn't faded or worn, his shirt was still in one piece, and his jacket was still solid despite its usage. He sealed away his weapon so as not to seem like a threat in a seal he placed on the small of his back. Will you relax? You don't need to be so nervous. Was Ahsoka's slightly exasperated response as she gently shoved his shoulder. Naruto looked at her and shrugged. I don't know these guys and councils tend to have the final say in things. I want to at least make a good impression. Obi-Wan nodded with a smile. You already made a good impression with Master Yoda, but I do have to agree that it would be best you impress the others on the council as they will have their own thoughts on this. Not to mention that perhaps one of them may gain an interest in you and may wish to train you themselves. Naruto looked at the man with a tilt of his head. Didn't you say you were going to be the one to train me? The man nodded as he elaborated. I did. But there may be someone else that is more appropriate to be your master. I am merely going to be the default in case there is one. I feel that you could be a good addition to our order. And even if I am your master, the others will teach you on occasion if I am unavailable. You are coming in at a very stressful time and you are too old to become part of the GD Academy. Naruto thought about what he was told and almost sounded incredulous when he spoke up. It almost sounds like I will be thrown around from person to person. Possibly, but only until you have reached an appropriate level to stay with one master. And one of them might wish to be your master, though if they already have a Padawan learner, they cannot take you on. But unless it is agreed, I shall be your default. Naruto thought about the 1 month of training during the Chunin exams. Kakashi had taught him for a week, making sure to work on his speed and touch up his control before the man went to teach Sasuke. He understood the reason since Sasuke was going against Gaara, a fellow Jinchuriki, while he was going against a Hyuga. Kakashi had taught him as much as he could about the Byakugan and let him know that he would have to stay on his toes to avoid being hit in chakra points. The man was able to replicate some of the moves so Naruto could practice avoiding the hits. Afterward, he was given to Ibisu and despite not being that impressive, had begun teaching him some elemental chakra control. They didn't have any chakra paper, but since fire jutsu was very typical in Konoha, they figured it would be the one that he would get through faster. But it turned out that Naruto had better results in wind with fire and water slightly behind, with earth and lightning being far behind. Naruto was able to get some of the exercises done, but not as much as they wished, even with clones. But it was a start. After that, he was trained by Jiraiya. From signing the Toad contract, practicing in seals, practicing in speed and strength, trying to see how far they could go with the QB chakra, as well as the beatings Naruto gave Jiraiya when he learned that the man was his godfather, they got a lot done. If his time here was going to be anything like that, Naruto was okay with that. But some consistency would be nice. The four made it to an elevator, and Naruto could not help but take a deep breath to calm himself. Obi-Wan nodded. There we go, I can sense your tension leaving you. You need not worry so much. Naruto looked at him and gained a dumbfounded look. You can sense tension with the Force. What can't you feel with it? Anakin chuckled at this. The potential for the Force can be seen as limitless. You can do many things with it, but you will learn more during your studies. Letting some of his childishness come to the surface, he had to ask. Can you fly? Anakin paused at that and sheepishly chuckled. Okay, almost limitless. I've never heard of any GD flying using the Force. Naruto slumped at that. Aw man, it would have been cool to learn you could. Obi-Wan looked at the two before speaking firmly. It isn't a toy. It is our connection with everything around us and binds us to all. Ahsoka smiled as she looked at the man. Already teaching him, huh? It's never too early to begin a lesson. The four went into a comfortable silence as the elevator stopped. They walked out and into a circular room that had the city in view as most of the walls were windows. In the room were 11 individuals sitting in the same kinds of chairs with one of them being empty. Naruto looked around at the ones sitting in the seats and tried to place the name of the race he was able to pick up from the ship console. He saw Yoda sitting in one of the seats and felt a little better since there was a smile on his face. There was a human of dark skin sitting next to him. The man seemed to bepitically look at him, but not in a negative way. The next one he noticed was, from what he was able to remember, was Kaldor. He was able to remember this one since he had seen images of the race, and the mask almost reminded him of Kakashi. After the Kaldor was a simple woman with a slightly dark tan skin complexion and had her hair set up in 2 loops. Another was a woman of dark skin, but she had some short tendrils that were coming out of the back of her head. The last human-looking person was a man that interestingly enough had multiple horns coming out of his head in no particular pattern. One of the odd ones was the one that looked like his head was completely made of hair. Despite it looking like it was a mess, it looked like it was an organized mess. Another one seemed to be a short creature that had tan skin, really large ears, and one of his eyes closed with a scare over it. His eyes then shifted to what he could accurately assume was a woman of the same race as Ahsoka. Then there was an alien that he remembered the name of but not much else, an Itachi. Another species that he was going to have to look up. The next one looked like he was an old man, but the thing that really stuck out was his tall head. He seemed to have that bepidical look that he had seen on Shikamaru's face when he was trying to solve a problem. The last one was the most notable as he had green skin, long hair like tentacles, and eyes that looked like large black orbs in place of eyes. The four moved to be in the center of the room and in the sight of all of the GD masters that sat in the chairs, with Naruto standing in front of the 2 older GD he came with. It was the dark-skinned man who spoke first. Master Obi-Wan, Anakin, we were informed about someone you wish to bring into the order. Obi-Wan nodded. Indeed, Master Windu, this boy here is someone I feel could be a welcome addition to the GD. He gestured at Naruto who stood there looking at everyone in the room. It was the one that had a tall head that spoke up. Is it wise to bring in someone so old into our order? He is far older than any that have come into the dot. Yoda picked up from here. Ah, older he may be, but willing to learn he is. Mace Windu leaned back in his seat. Whether he is willing to learn isn't the issue. Someone of his age would not be able to integrate into our order. The Kaldor was next to speak. Regardless of his apparent age, we should get to know the one that had been brought to us. Obi-Wan did inform us that he would bring the boy for us to meet. Naruto looked at all of the GD that now had their eyes on him and couldn't help but feel slightly nervous. Sure, he could stand up to the Shinobi Council back home, but he felt that he couldn't mess with it without some consequences. Rubbing the back of his head he asked. Well, what do you want to know about me? It was the one of the same race as Ahsoka that spoke. It would be informative if you just tell us your story and why you chose to come along with Obi-Wan. Naruto looked at her and thought about what he should tell them. He should have realized that he would have to tell his story at some point, but he had figured he would have been able to avoid it. He quickly thought about how he should do this and came up with a way that can keep his secret. He was a shinobi. Telling the truth was something he would prefer to do, telling the truth by misdirecting the secret is what he was trained to do. My full name is Naruto Uzumaki Namikaze, age 13. I lost my parents on the day of my birth and don't have any living relatives. I come from Konoha, the village hidden in the leaves. My father was the former leader of the village and had sacrificed his life along with my mother on the day I was born after a tragic attack that took the lives of so many people in my home. Due to my birth being on the same day, a stigma was placed on me as the village pariah and hated by a majority of the people that live there. The adults that survived the attack see me as its cause and have done what they could to antagonize me. Those with kids tell them that they should stay away from me or belittle me. There were even attempts on my life as they could not stand the sight of me walking the streets. The three that brought him here were surprised to hear that he had a rough childhood in a village that looked so peaceful. They had not noticed any of this in the village while they were there, but Obi-Wan and Anakin could not feel any deception in his words. Ahsoka looked him up and down and could not understand how someone could deal with it. His own home wanted him dead. For all my life I had lived in a village that had hated me as I was a reminder of the tragedy that happened. But I have done what I could to move past what they see me as and chose to protect them even though they hated me. The GD that heard his story eyed him with some of them using the force to see if he was lying. So far none of them have felt any deception coming from him, but they were curious. Shakti's features softened as she gestured to the boy and asked. Tell us, why have you protected them if there was such animosity towards you? There are older ones that would have cast off such a place and find a new place to live. Is this your attempt of escape? Naruto sighed as he shook his head. Though the idea came to my mind, I chose to be better and not let it get to me. Letting all their anger and hatred get to me would accomplish nothing. I've seen what I could have become if I let anger or hatred define me and I didn't like it. He thought back to Gaara and knew that he could have been just as crazed as the Redeed used to be if he allowed Yami to take over at the time. Now Yami was something that he accepted as his dark half, they just chose to stay as is. Yoda folded his hands on his lap as he looked at the boy with a little more interest. Strong, you are. Cast aside your anger, you have. Thoughts on coming here, we wish to know. Naruto nodded. Like I said, the idea of leaving the village did come to mind, but it isn't the reason I took up the offer to come here to be trained in the Force. I just thought that it was an opportunity that no one on my planet has ever gotten before and I couldn't pass it up. My planet doesn't have any of the flying vehicles, consoles, or droids. The Republic, which I learned is the government of all the planets, doesn't even know about my planet and we didn't know there was anything beyond our planet. Wise would it not be to bring into the Republic? Naruto shook his head. I was told that it was a sheer accident that my planet was found by Obi-Wan, Anakin, and Ahsoka. He gestured to the three behind him before looking back to Yoda. And when I learned that the people here are in the middle of the war, I didn't want it to end up at my home, so I asked all the records that would lead to my planet to be deleted. Hitfisto raised his hand and gestured to the boy as he asked. What about you? You said that you asked for all records to be deleted, but would that not mean that you would not be able to go home? Naruto looked up with a solemn look on his face. I may never go home again, but to make sure that the people there are safe, I don't mind never seeing it again. The GD looked at each other at that. Someone who is willing to sacrifice going home in order to protect it from the galactic war is admirable. Ayadimundi thought about what was said as he had caught a glimpse of people that came to the boy's mind, but it was odd. Wanting to clarify something, he asked. Your thoughts dwell on the friend you have left behind, are you not saddened that you will not see them again? He could feel no sadness, no regret, not even a twinge of wanting to see them again in the boy. Naruto shook his head. Even though I made so many friends back home and I might never see them again, I know that they are still okay and will go on without me. And in our line of work, I was taught that at any time, anyone could die, and even if we may get close to each other, we have to move on and keep going. Mace Windu raised an eyebrow as he asked. And what was this line of work you were part of? Naruto gave a look of confusion at him before he looked back at the three he came with. I thought you would have been told by them before we came here. Shrugging his shoulders, he answered. In my village, there are many that work as shinobi. Soldiers that work as a military power to defend the village. I was one of them and I was training to become one since there was no other career path I could do. No one would actually hire me if I went to work for them. Yoda tilted his head as he asked. Willing to show us skills you learned? Naruto thought about what he could show and chose to go with something simple. Looking up, he bent his knees and jumped up to the ceiling. Vegeta watched as he jumped up high, with several of them noticing that he wasn't using the force to do so. But all of them were interested when they saw him standing on the ceiling as if it was the floor. Naruto smiled wide as he looked down at the others. This was one of the most commonly used ones. The ability to walk on surfaces. We are also taught how to move fast in order to get to places on foot. We don't have any of the flying ships I saw when I got here. Most of the places we have to get to are usually on foot. He dropped back in place and rubbed the back of his head nervously as he saw that some of them were intrigued at what he had just done. Shakti gained an inquisitive look as she could tell it wasn't done with the force. Is it possible to learn this? Naruto paused as he didn't think he would be asked that. I know that these guys could use the force, but I don't know if they can use chakra. He scratched his cheek as he nervously answered. I don't know. What I just did uses something other than the force. On my home planet, we never heard of the force until these three landed on it. Obi-Wan chose now to speak on this. That is indeed true. And from our time on the planet, I could not feel anyone else touched by the force. Naruto here is the only one that was detectable to be incredibly force sensitive. Shakti leaned back in her seat with an inquisitive look. So, this boy is the only one you could sense to have the force, as well as the abilities that are common on his planet. Obi-Wan nodded. Vegeta Council looked at each other as they knew they had to discuss this. Mace Windu was the one to look at the four presented to him and spoke. We must discuss this matter among each other. He looked at Anakin, Ahsoka, and the boy. We will inform you of our decision on the matter. Naruto felt more relaxed as he slumped a bit before looking at the other two that were gestured at, and they moved to walk out of the room. He looked at Obi-Wan as he passed and smiled as the man gave him an affirmative nod. He then left with the other two, leaving Obi-Wan alone with the others. Once they were sure that the other three were out of the room, Mace Windu spoke. Can you inform us why you have chosen to bring this boy to us? He is well beyond the age we would take someone so young into our order. And from what we were told, he already has training in another organization. His loyalties already seem to be with them. Obi-Wan nodded as he saw this as well. That may be, but I don't think his potential should be hindered because of this. I have a feeling he could integrate into our order well enough. Shakti spoke up next. He may have been trained in the abilities of his home, but from what he had told us, the connections he has with it are very few in a sea of such anger. He has left it behind, and despite how he has said that it was his home, I feel that he is rather detached from it due to the treatment he had dealt with. Yoda hummed as he nodded in agreement. Strong-willed, he is. Clouded it was, but home I saw. Such anger, such hate, but positive he has remained. He smiled at this. Despite how he had said that his past was shrouded, he saw glimpses of his time in the village and how he was able to push past it and stay as happy as he was now. In other ways, he has been trained, but child innocence I sense. Ayadimundi was next to speak. I worry that he would be too far behind to truly become part of the order. He would need to learn much about the galaxy since he had stated that he had no prior knowledge of our commodities. Obi-Wan smiled a little as he spoke up. He would be even further behind since the spelling he has is much different from the one we use. But he has said that he has a quick way to catch up with those around him. And from the amount of bravado he has, I am tempted to believe he could. He then felt that he should add a point towards the boy. Though, when he first wielded a lightsaber, he was proficient in deflecting some blaster fire. This caught their attention as Mace asked. Are you saying that he had used one of your weapons against you? It was more of a situation where he was given the opportunity to do so, and from what I could tell, he allowed the force to guide his actions. And he wasn't even aware of it. Hitfisto nodded as he crossed his arms. Interesting. He was interested in this since it almost sounded like it was like the kid was using Form 1 of lightsaber combat. Shaicho. A style that allows the user to allow the force to take over and is mostly used by children. It was the same style that he had mastered. Shakti spoke next as she was curious about how the boy was so confident that he would catch up. Did he inform you how he would reach the level of others? Obi-Wan thought about what he knew till he remembered one of the most intriguing skills he had shown them. He is capable of duplicating himself. And one of the things that he had told us is that he gains the memories of the clones. I am unsure if he has another way, but this sounds like it could be useful in such a matter. The other GT looked at each other as this sounded like a very useful ability. Mace Windu then spoke up. I do not see him being able to join us, but since you already said you would take him on as an apprentice to allow him to join our order, his place among us is already set. But due to his lack of knowledge, he will need to spend a good amount of time learning what he can. Since he has no place to go, we can house him in one of the empty Padawan rooms in the temple. He will be limited in what he can learn, and his studies should be supervised by a master, so he does not delve into areas he should not. Plo Koon nodded as he agreed that the boy should be supervised in his studies. I look forward to seeing the potential that you have seen. Obi-Wan smiled with slight cheek as he spoke. Oh, I'm sure that he will surprise us. Yoda chuckled as he had no doubt the new boy would do just that. Indeed. Much to learn he has, and learn from him we might. After a few more minutes of going over the fine details of Naruto's day, Obi-Wan left the council room and met up with the others. I see you are anxious to know what was decided. Naruto nodded as he was interested in knowing how things would go. Once things are set, he can start to work on what he can. Obi-Wan nodded as he spoke up. It has been decided that for the time being, you will stay at the GD Temple in order to study up on general knowledge, as well as the GD way of things. Your studies will be supervised by a GD master while you are here, and they will begin teaching you the ways of the Force when they deem you adequate enough to begin. They were informed about your lack of knowledge of what we know, so do not be surprised if they treat you as they would one of the children. Ahsoka stepped forward and asked. And who would be his master? Obi-Wan chuckled at this. Despite how I said I would take up the role, I noticed that a few of them seemed to take an interest in you. After you have studied up and trained a bit in the Force, we will hold a little test for you. Once we all see what you have learned at the time, then we will choose who will be your permanent master. Till then, the one supervising you will help you in these matters. We are doing this due to the fact that many of us have responsibilities elsewhere and will not always be available. However, once your official master is set, you will be sent to tag along with them through most of their duties. Anakin whistles at that. Almost sounds like he is given special treatment. Obi-Wan chuckled. Not at all. This is just a particular case, but not that dissimilar to many other Padawans that do not have a set master. Or shall I remind you of how young Ahsoka here was set to join us on a mission to prove that she is best served to be your Padawan? Anakin crossed his arms and gave his former master a dirty look. Let's not forget that you set me up for that one. I have no idea what you are talking about. The cheeky smile on the man's face told them everything. Ahsoka looked at Naruto and smirked. Looks like you are now part of the GD Order. Don't forget to learn what you can from us while you're here. Naruto returned the smoke as he responded with. Let's not forget who won that fight back on my planet. Ahsoka's smirk turned into pursed lips as she pouted at him. Yeah, we'll see who wins the next time, and without your clones. Naruto smiled back at her. I'll go easy on you. The two stared at each other for a second before they chuckled at that. Obi-Wan and Anakin waited for them to finish their little banter before Obi-Wan gestured for them to follow. Come, I'll show you where you will be staying. Naruto had forgotten that he didn't have anywhere to stay. And he doubted that he would be able to find a place if he didn't have any of the currency for the planet, and the only ones he knew were them. So it was much to his relief that he would be getting accommodations for him to sleep. Nodding, he followed the man as they made their way through the temple. They made it to a hallway that Naruto could tell housed a few rooms for people to stay in. He made sure he counted how many doors he had to walk past, since all the doors were the same and there were no distinguishing markings that would allow him to tell which one would be his. After walking past a good amount, they stopped at one of the doors and Obi-Wan opened a door and gestured for them to enter. Naruto walked in after the man and looked around the room. It was very small and only had a mat that he figured he was to use to sleep in. It was very Spartan, but he didn't really mind. When you had learned to sleep in any sort of area, this was something very simple. There was only one small window that let in sunlight and he couldn't help but have a thought. I think I've seen prison cells just like this. But at least the door can be opened. Obi-Wan spoke up to the boy. This will be your room while you are learning. I suppose it may seem very bare, but actually, I don't mind it. I've slept in a room like this before. Mostly as a way to get me to be adaptable. He had to thank Anko for doing that, since as someone in the T&I department, she wanted to make sure he was ready for any sort of issues. Obi-Wan nodded. Well, now that you have a room of your own, we will leave you to it. Tomorrow someone will come to get you to begin your studies. And several of us are looking forward to seeing your progress. Anakin crossed his arms. I know I am. The two left the room with Ahsoka following them, but the younger one paused for a second and turned to Naruto. She reached into her pocket as she spoke. Oh, I almost forgot to give you this. She brought out a small data disk and held it out for him to take. Naruto reached out and took it before holding it up and examining it. What is it? Ahsoka smiled as she answered. It is a data disk that holds the coordinates to your home. Naruto looked shocked at that and looked at her. But I said. And all the records have been removed from the ship's logs. But R2 has a record of it and I asked him to make a data disk that had it so I could give it to you. Even if you are going to be part of the GD Order and you don't want the war to get to your home, you should at least have a way to get there when you are allowed to. Naruto looked at the disk and smiled. Thanks, Ahsoka. I would like to take credit, but it was Anakin's idea. He gave her a smirk. Then tell him I said thanks. But thank you for giving it to me. Well, you'll get the chance to thank me some other time, Whiskers. Now that you are part of something bigger. Naruto chuckled as he saw her leave his room. We'll see, Snips. She spun around and glared at him. "Don't call me that." She left the room and caught up with her master and Obi-Wan. Naruto looked at the disc and let out a relieved sigh. "Well, this is one thing I don't have to worry about." He turned it in his hand before he reached behind him and unsealed his supplies. After unsealing a few more of his things, he unfurled the large scroll and unsealed some ink and a brush before he made a new seal in the large scroll. Once he was sure it was dry, he placed the data disc on it and sealed it away. He then moved to the wall to the right of the door and made another seal, and then sealed all of his supplies into it, making sure that the sealing array disappeared from sight. Happy with that, he sat cross-legged on the sleeping mat and smirked. "Well, here we go. Time skip." It had been a few days since Naruto had become part of the GD in training, and Naruto was finding it interesting so far. The first thing that he was made to do was learn the most commonly used alphabet that the galaxy used. Aurebesh. He was being escorted by one of his supervisors that would be teaching him how to read. Shakti. The older Togruta had been the one to retrieve him in the morning, though she was surprised to see that he was already up when she arrived, since she knew that the young tend to want to sleep in. She explained why she was the first one to teach him, as she was the one that had started supervising the development of the clones on Kamino, the planet where all the clones were created. On the way, she chose to learn more about the boy. She looked down to her right as the boy walked next to her. "So tell me, what other abilities were you taught while you were on your planet?" Naruto thought about some of the simple jutsu that would give nothing away and smiled. "Well, you already know about how I can walk on walls, but there is another version of it that allows me to walk on water. It is a lot harder to do, but it does help when I have to get past a river." "And how are you able to do these techniques? I recall you saying that you use something other than the force in order to do these." He thought about whether he should tell her or not, but after figuring that since none of them had chakra, it would do no harm. "The energy I have inside me is called chakra. By manipulating this energy, it allows me to walk on multiple surfaces. It also allows me to run faster than someone who doesn't have it. It can also increase my strength in case I need it." It sounds like this energy can be used to boost your physical capabilities. Must be very useful for daily life. "Well, I tend not to use it for simple things. Only when I am in a hurry or need to move things. Stuff like that." "And what sort of things were you doing on your planet? You said that you were a soldier in training." Naruto shrugged his shoulders. "Since I was only just starting my time as one, I did simple jobs. Like painting fences, pulling weeds, taking care of pets, and picking up groceries." When Shakti heard the word pet, several species that she knew that no child should handle. A rancor comes to mind. "What sort of pets did you deal with?" Naruto wondered what kind of question that was, but he remembered that he was on another planet, so maybe they had other kinds of animals. "Just some dogs and cats, but mostly cats, since they tend to get out of their houses a lot. They tend to be found in trees, so I just go up and pick them up before taking them back." Shakti nodded as she was able to understand that these animals would be small in size if he was able to pick them up by himself. No matter how much his energy could augment his physical abilities, it surely wasn't that grand of a feat. Moving the topic along, a part of her wished to know something about him. "Young one, may I ask you something about an aspect of your life?" Naruto looked up at her and thought about the question. The way it was worded told him that it might be a personal question. Wanting to see what the GD would want to know about him, he nodded. "Sure, you can ask. Why did you not leave your village for another place of residence? You mentioned that there were attempts on your life yet you remained, why is that?" "Ah, the why didn't you leave question. Don't need to lie about this one or work around it." Looking ahead, his mood became somber. Better to live in a prison than wander an animal's den. Not hearing the usual follow-up question, he continued. "The world I am from has its own conflict. The village I live in is just one of 5, and each of them has bad blood with the other. If I were to leave the village, anywhere I go would be a risk, since if someone from another village spotted me, they would either capture me and interrogate me to learn what they could of the village I came from, or kill me out of anger or spite against my home." "How would they be able to learn where you are from?" "The details Master Obi-Wan gave us informed us that no other race is on your planet. Skin color, clothing, even information that they got from spies. There are many ways to tell where someone is from, and if they notice it, then a fight would be a sure thing." He then let out a sigh as he knew of a warhawk and 2 other old fossils that would throw a fit if he left. "And even if I wasn't caught by another village, the one I left would send units to bring me back to avoid me from spilling out secrets. If they couldn't catch me, they would kill me." Shakti felt bad for the boy as such a life was not ideal, but it was not her planet, and her planet's customs could also be seen as cruel in the eyes of many. Only the strong survive, and she could say for certain that this boy is strong in spirit if he was able to deal with all the hatred, mistreatment, and danger he faces just by being on the planet. "Were there not a few that would not have liked you leaving? Did Obi-Wan tell you about the attack before we left?" She thought for a second till she nodded in understanding. Ah, so there were some that tried to retrieve you. Is it wise then, to tell me about these? Naruto shook his head. Everything I told you is public knowledge and I was so low in the ranks that I wasn't told anything of importance. But I know the value of information. It can help in many different things in life. It all depends on the information. You're wise for someone so young. But I still have much to learn. But you do. The two made it to the GD archives, and Naruto could not help but look in awe. He was able to tell that there were no books on the shelves, but seeing someone else pull one of the glowing lights off the shelf, he was able to tell that they were small consoles, what he later learned were called data pads. He followed Shakti to meet with an elderly woman called Jocasta. Once the now-figured librarian was informed of the situation, they were directed to the area that was used for the children to learn languages. Naruto did his best not to feel embarrassed that he had to go to the children's area by telling himself that it was necessary. Once Shakti had grabbed the datapad they needed, they moved to one of the consoles in the center of the library and inserted the said datapad into the side of the console to appear on the larger screen. We shall begin with the letters and the sound they are linked to. Naruto nodded as he sat in the seat and began to listen to the lesson. He wasn't going to ignore these like he would with Iruka's lessons, since this wasn't a repeat of something he heard before, and this had far more importance if he wanted to continue to be in the GD order. These lessons went on for a couple of days to make sure that he was able to get the information right. And even when it was sure that he was able to get it right after the first three, the woman spent a couple more just as a precaution. He didn't tell her that he had spent some time in his room with his clones, testing himself to make sure he was able to get through it fast. Now the only thing that he needed to work on was his speed of reading. When he was told that he now knew the language, Shakti informed him that he would begin learning about the basic technologies. He would need to know how to work on some of the simple things that the general public had. Much like before, they were directed to a section of the archives. As Shakti grabbed a datapad, Naruto had a question. Master Shakti. After the first 2 days, he had learned that it was best he called all of the GD that he would be learning from Master. He was just glad that it was more of a rank than anything else. Shakti looked at him and gave him a curious look. Yes. Naruto looked in the aisle they were in and asked. Is everything we are going to learn in this aisle? Shakti looked at the aisle before shaking her head. For the basics, it is this one and a few on both sides. She gestured at each shelf to give the general direction of the material they would be learning for the next few days. Naruto looked up to the top of the shelf before looking at the other one. Mentally figuring out the amount he would need, he smiled. Okay then. He put his index and middle finger into a cross-hand seal and spoke. Shadow Clone Jutsu. He spoke it rather than shouting it since he is in a library. The two were then engulfed in a large puff of smoke, and Shakti tensed as she did not know what was going on to cause the smokescreen. She dropped the datapad and reached for her lightsaber, but before the datapad touched the ground, it was caught by Naruto and held up to her. Careful, I don't know how durable these things are, but I don't want to damage it. Naruto, get behind me as there is. She paused in her speech as she saw that the aisle was now full of identical Narutos. One of the Narutos then spoke to the group. Okay, guys, you know what to do. With a nod, the clones began to move to the other aisles, with some grabbing data pads off the shelves. The one that spoke walked up to the clone that caught the datapad. Shakti dropped and grabbed it, letting that clone go off as well. He smiled up at the surprised look the woman had. Sorry for the shock. Shakti looked down at him and realized that this must be the cloning ability that Obi-Wan had told them. Registering the apology, she shook her head. I just admit that I am a bit surprised. Being told of something and witnessing it is much different. She then looked at the ones emptying out the shelf before trying to remember to turn on the datapads and asked the one in front of her. He had told us that you are able to retrieve the memories of your clones. Is this the way you intend to catch up with the others? Yeah, once I catch up, I can slow down and go at a normal pace. He held up the datapad in his hand and asked. Ready to start? Shakti took the pad and asked. If you are able to learn the material at a much faster pace, would it not be better to do so with all of the material? She asked as she was unsure why he would still want to go with her. Not only that, she wanted to know why he would not just learn all of the things in the library. Naruto looked at his clones before shaking his head. Even if I can learn everything in here at a fast pace, it loses the personal attention that I would get. Just cause I can learn the words and such doesn't mean I'm going to fully understand them. So my clones can learn the stuff, but you can make me understand. Not only that, if I learn how to do something, like a dance or fighting move, I have to practice it myself to make sure I get it right. So there are limits. Everything has limits, you can only push the limits to be bigger, not infinite. Shakti nodded with a smile. You truly are wise for your age. Thank you. For the next few weeks, Naruto and Shakti had spent their time in the library archives, learning what they needed for Naruto to live in the galaxy. After Naruto had informed her that he had finished looking over the stuff in the datapads, he would ask questions about the things he didn't understand, and she would explain them to him with a clone or two next to him, so he would get it. When she asked why he would have a clone or two with him when he had the questions, he explained that since the clones as a whole are energy, when he regains the memories, they are permanently stored in his head. Like a more advanced way of photographic memory. Though it was still possible to forget things. The cast anew as well as the others that entered the library were shocked when Naruto used his clone jutsu. They had never seen something like this before and Naruto gained a bit of an audience when he did so. Obi-Wan thought it was amusing when he came in since he had already seen it. He learned multiple things thanks to the method. The basics of technology, other alien races, their customs, advanced mechanics, piloting, galactic mapping, military history, diplomacy, science, investigation, ancient history, medical science, and a few other areas that would seem necessary. Another thing that had changed was his attire. He no longer wore his Anbu pants, his short-sleeved shirt, and his burnt orange short jacket. He now wore an outfit like he had some of the other GD. The undershirt and pants were dark burnt orange and a black leather vest and boots. He was able to keep a sash and use it as a belt to keep the long vest in place and a leather belt over it. He thought that it was a little odd to have long sleeves with wide bell-like ends, but he figured he might get used to it. He even had to braid a strand of his hair on the right side of his head. One thing he made sure he did was make sure that Tsunade's necklace wasn't visible, so he put it under his clothing. In Anakin's movie outfit, but instead of brown his cloth clothing is dark burnt orange. Once it was seen that Naruto had the necessary knowledge he required to at least be able to live, Shakti told him that he would be taught other matters by someone else. The two stood in front of Naruto's room as it was the end of their time together. It was a pleasure to be your master for the time. Naruto bowed to her as he showed his gratitude. And I thank you for all the help you gave me, Master Shakti. She nodded as she bowed back. I will see you again when you are evaluated. As you know, keep in mind what you have gained and know there is much more to learn. Yes, Master Shakti. After that, the woman left the young learner in his room with Naruto going inside. Once inside, Naruto sat down on his sleeping roll and leaned against the wall. He thought about everything he had learned, but there was one thing his mind kept going to. The GD code. He learned about the GD code and the way things were, and even when he agreed to follow the code so long as he was to become a GD, he had some personal thoughts about it. The GD code forbade GD Knights and GD Masters from taking on more than one Padawan at a given time, which would explain why he wouldn't be taught by any GD that already had a Padawan. But he had to question this since he had come from a team of 4 with 1 sensei and 3 students. Kakashi made sure that he had time to teach each of them and helped out in areas where he could. Though, this could be seen as an apprenticeship where the sensei could focus all their time on the student in areas they needed. Sakura was a good example since Kakashi had seen that she was more suited for a genjutsu or medical shinobi role. It is why he put in a recommendation to Tsunade to take her on as an apprentice when the woman came back to the village. But before that, he did his best to collaborate with Kurenai for a genjutsu role. The code forbade GD from forming attachments. The GD code forbade possession and attachments. The GD were encouraged and trained to love in terms of compassion. Attachment was the inability to accept change as the fundamental characteristic of life, to accept death as the natural part of life, the inability to let go. Feeding into fear of loss and greed, leading to jealousy, attachment was selfish, a shadow of greed, and thus a path of the dark side of the force. Therefore, attachment was forbidden for a GD, who had to train themselves to let go of everything they were afraid to lose, to renounce all attachments. Thus, they could be compassionate and loving and caring, but not be possessive and grabbing and holding on to things, trying to keep them frozen in time, accepting the transitional nature of life. This allowed them to love the totality of life unconditionally without selectively choosing individual life forms to become selfishly attached to. He found this to be like dangling a steak in front of someone taught to adore steak. It almost sounds like you are taught to love everything, but not care what happens. This was something he thought to be a little backward. With some thought, he could understand it as a way to tell them that no matter what it is, it has a chance of disappearing and that you should let it go when it does. He could get that. But to act like it is the same as dropping your favorite kunai into the sea and not being able to get it back just sounds so detached. You might as well have a robot be a GD, since they will logically let it go as an unnecessary part of their job. Save a life but don't care for it. Yeah, Naruto has his issues with it. And you are said to be compassionate to all. How can you be compassionate if you don't care what happened to them afterward? That sort of compassion would just be an insult. After a bit of discussion with Yami, Kurama, and himself, Clone, they found something else about the code. Not something that was written in it but something it lacked. The GD code banned neither romantic feelings nor familial love. You would think that would be at the top in big bold letters, but nowhere in the code did it say such things. The three could not help but shout out in his head loophole. This wasn't because he was thinking of getting into a relationship, it was just that it was the more obvious find he could, and for the fact that if they could exploit one thing, they could exploit many other things about the code. If it isn't written, it can't be forbidden. Another part of the code was that it forbade the GD from killing unarmed opponents, as well as seeking revenge. Okay, the seeking revenge thing he had nothing against. But an unarmed opponent? Do the GD not realize that even without a weapon, a person can still be deadly? He practiced with Tenten all the time, and 9 out of 10 times he would lose his weapon and have to fight her with his fists while she still had a kunai, sword, or whatever she could pull from her scrolls. This was one that he would most vehemently ignore. He wasn't going to get killed because some person or alien didn't have a weapon. He sighed as he felt his head hurt from the amount of information that he gained. He smiled as he remembered the day he tried to study the material for the alien races and customs. Shakti nearly panicked at the sight of him collapsing onto the ground after most of his clones dispelled, and he was hit with information overload. He didn't realize that the datapads had so much more information than the other previous material, but given the subject, he should have seen it coming. The same thing almost happened when he studied ancient history, but he was able to stop the mass of clones from dispelling at the same time. There was so much information he had to learn that he had done less of his jutsu training. But he had tried some of the medical jutsu Tsunade put into the material she packed for him. He knew for a fact that he was absolutely terrible at it, but he figured that she put it in since there would not be anyone who could heal him in such a manner, and she didn't know the medical advancements that the Republic had. He figured that he would at least do his best. But the many chakra burns he got on his hand trying to do the mystic palm jutsu told him that it would be a long time till he could even get close to it. Now that his studies with Shakti were over, he wondered who he would train under next. He was surprised to learn that he was being trained by Master Yoda. His training with Master Yoda would be in feeling the force and using it. He followed the master through the GD temple, as the master told him that they would be using one of the rooms he used to teach. The thing is that he would be learning from the master along with the children that were younger than him. They walked into the room and saw that the kids were already there waiting the Grandmaster. All of the kids greeted Yoda at the same time. "Good morning, Master Yoda." "You as well, younglings. A new student we have." Naruto smiled sheepishly at the kids and waved. "They're even younger than Konohamaru. Good morning." He noticed that a bunch of the kids were not just humans but aliens as well. One of the kids, a female Rhodian, spoke up in curiosity. "Isn't he too old to be here? Shouldn't he be ahead of us?" Yoda nodded as this would normally be the case. "Truth you speak, but arrived very recently, young Uzumaki has." It was then that one of the male students with short blue hair gained a look of realization. "Hey, I remember seeing you in the GD archives. I saw you turn into multiple of you. How did you do that?" It was when he said this that the other kids began to realize that they had seen him doing that as well, while a few of them had heard of the event. Naruto smiled at the attention he was given, but he figured that they needed to get on with the lesson. "Oh, Iruka would have a heart attack if he heard me want to get to a lesson." He looked at the kids and spoke. "Sorry, but it is complicated and we should get to what Master Yoda has to teach us." "Indeed. Younglings, take positions you should." The kids were a little disappointed that they wouldn't learn about it, but they obeyed the Grandmaster. They moved to the side to a rack that had some small lightsabers, all of them looking the exact same, and a grey ball of sorts. After they grabbed one each, they grabbed helmets and moved back to their spots and put the helmets on with them tilted back so they would not cover their eyes. Yoda looked at Naruto and nodded. "Join your fellow Padawans, you should." Naruto got the message and moved over to the same rack and picked up the same items. He moved to stand a few feet away from the kids towards the door. Since he was bigger. Yoda stood in front of all of the children as he looked at the eager faces of all of the children. "Begin your training in the Force we shall." He watched as the kids put on their helmets and Naruto followed suit. He chuckled as he saw the older boy take the helmet off and looked at it as if he had done something wrong. Naruto tried to find the right way to put the helmet on since he couldn't see anything when he did. "Is there a right way to put this on?" One of the students, a Wookiee, spoke to him as he tilted the helmet back to look at him. "The helmet is supposed to block your sight. You are not supposed to see anything." Naruto heard this and tried to translate what was said. It took him a second since he still needed to practice, but he was able to get it. "Thanks." He put the helmet back on and just went with the fact that he couldn't see anything. Smiling at the small interaction, Yoda continued. "Remember, ally is the Force, and a powerful ally it is. Life creates it, makes it grow. Its energy surrounds us, binds us. You must feel the Force flow around you. Here, between you, me, the air, the trees, even between the land and the ship that fly through the sky. Begin your training you must." Naruto heard the lightsabers being turned on and a sudden humming. Holding the lightsaber in his hand, he made sure he held it so the blade would come out upward and ran his thumb around till he found the switch. Igniting it, he felt the orb in his other hand lift from his hand and a closer humming came to his ear. Another sound that came to his ear was the sound of what he thought was a Zep. He heard multiple of them and wondered what was going on. He sort of got an idea when he suddenly felt a sting in his shoulder. He wondered what it was but after a few seconds, he felt another one on his hip. Arg. He got hit a few more times till he chose that he needed to see what it was that was stinging him. He saw that it was the small gray ball he had picked up. The thing was floating in the air, moving left and right and rotating before it shot at him with a small laser bolt. Naruto yelped at being hit in the chest and looked at the other kids and saw that they were blocking the ones aimed at them and realized what they were doing. He heard some chuckling and saw Yoda standing in front of him. Used to sight you are, use your feelings you must. Guide you the force will. He smiled as he looked up around the room. All around you, you must focus. Lie to you, your senses can, the force, guide your movements at will. Naruto looked around the room and tried to use the senses he was used to try and feel the force, but he couldn't feel anything different. Obi-Wan told me that I did it before, but I don't know how I did it. Indeed, instinct you used, act on it you should and feel for it you will. Naruto nodded, but just before he was about to put his helmet back on he paused and looked at the kids as he felt the need to ask. Also, isn't it dangerous to have them wield these? I've seen what they can do and I'm a little worried that the kids might cut something off. Yoda nodded as he knew that the blade is very dangerous and should not be used by children. Dangerous fully powered they are but low strength they are. Hurt you, they will but small the amount. Naruto looked at the one in his hand and was surprised to learn that the power of these things could be adjusted to be used for kids. And if he got it right, they could still hurt but not cut through you. He still remembered them cutting his kunai and did not like the idea that kids would be using them, but telling him that they would just hurt him was relieving. He nodded as he put his helmet back on and tried to get a feel for the force as he tried to recreate what he did when the clones attacked him. Yoda nodded as he moved back to stand in front of the group of children who had not stopped their practice. After some time, Yoda tapped his cane on the ground to get their attention. Younglings, practiced enough you have. The children turned off their lightsabers and lifted their helmets up so they could watch the Grandmaster. Done well you have. Tomorrow, more practice we will do. The kids nodded till they heard. Pew. Ow. Pew. Ow. Pew. Ow. They all turned to where they heard it and saw Naruto splayed on the ground with the helmet covering his face, his lightsaber still in his hand but laying on the ground and him still being shot at. Pew. Ow. The kids laughed at the funny scene and even Yoda chuckled at the sight. Naruto used his free hand to tilt the helmet a bit so his eye could shift to the kids. He couldn't help but smile at the sight of laughing kids, even if they were laughing at him. I think I need a lot more practice in using the force. Pew. Ow. Learning how to feel the force was much harder than Naruto originally thought. For the first few days, he had no success in feeling anything different. Every time he returned to his room after they did the laser blocking practice, he always felt phantom pains from being shot at. But due to his inability to feel the force, he felt that it would be best to practice some of the jutsu that he was given to learn. It was during this time that he learned that he could make a shadow clone with the least amount of chakra he needed to practice the mystical palm jutsu. After a lot more practice, he won't need the clone to do the jutsu. He even had Kurama pull back as much of his chakra as he could to make it easier. He had to focus on this because Tsunade made sure to write in big letters. Learn this first. Naruto worked a bit on the other things, including seals, but he made sure to focus on this bit of medical jutsu. He didn't know why, but he had a feeling that Tsunade would know if he didn't and kill him when he went back. Now he was sitting in a large training area outside with Obi-Wan in front of him. Heard you've been making quite a name for yourself during your training. Nearly shocked poor Jocasta knew into a heart attack when she saw the sudden appearance of all of you. Naruto sheepishly rubbed his head as he nervously laughed. Yeah, I had to apologize to her when I came back the next day and told her the reason for it. Shocked he also nearly pulled out her lightsaber when I first did it. Obi-Wan nodded. Indeed. I think it best that you try not to shock that many GD while you are here. Don't want any accidents. Yes Master Kenobi. Obi-Wan smiled as he sat in front of the boy and started. So I have heard that you have been having trouble with feeling the force with Master Yoda. Yeah, I told him that I was able to do it before when you arrived on my planet, but I can't seem to get it again. Obi-Wan rubbed his beard as he thought about it. If I had to guess, it was due to fully immersing yourself into a state that allowed you to use the force without consciously using it. And with how you are used to your chakra, you could not feel it. After a minute of thought he spoke. I suggest that you let go of everything you know and follow your instincts on this. Naruto leaned back as he looked up at the sky. Let go of everything I know. Sounds like the GD way of things. Figuring that there would be no harm in trying to do that for the moment, he sighed, sat up straight, and closed his eyes as he tried to feel for the force. He chose to ignore his chakra, forget his training on how to fight, and just exist. Obi-Wan watched as the boy tried once more to feel for the force. He would have thought that training with Master Yoda would have been enough, but it might be that the boy needed to hear something or try something different in order to feel it. After all, everyone learns the force differently than others. He focused his senses on the boy and could still feel the force the boy had, but so far, there was no solid connection. It was after 15 minutes that the man smiled. Everything was black for Naruto. It was different from when he usually did this to enter his mindscape. It was just him, no Yami, no Kurama, no Obi-Wan, it was just him. Suddenly, he felt something. At first, he could only feel a small bit of it, but as the seconds passed, it grew bigger and bigger, and then the darkness gained light. The hazing version of the whole area he was in appeared, even a hazy Obi-Wan appeared in front of him. But it wasn't so much seeing it was like feeling it. Obi-Wan smiled as he could feel that Naruto had started connecting with the force and the amount of power the boy had. He lifted his hand and lowered his head as if looking at it, but his eyes were still closed. So this is the force. He lowered his hand back to his lap and then almost heard something. Something telling him to focus on the rocks around him. Choosing to follow the suggestion, he did just that. Upon a higher level, Grandmaster Yoda, Mace Windu, and Kit Fisto looked down at the two, with the smallest of the three smiling at the sight. Connected with the force he has. Kit Fisto nodded. And it is a strong connection from what I can tell. The next part of his training will see if he can let the force guide his movements. I am looking forward to teaching him what I can of the lightsaber forms. Yoda smiled as he thought about his time with the boy. No rush we have. Fond of him the children are. Mace Windu crossed his arms as he thought about the boy. I believe he is rushing his training far too quickly. To go through everything in such a manner can be seen as an ambitious leap toward power. I say we should keep an eye on him to make sure he does not fall to the dark side. With his interesting abilities and his rapid growth in the force, we cannot be too careful. I feel there is more to him, things that he hasn't told us. Yoda's smile dropped as he also had these thoughts about the boy, but he so far had shown no signs of the dark side, and he was more trying to make others smile, including the children. Judge him poorly, we will not. But caution we will have. Down with Naruto, several of the rocks around him were floating in the air as he continued to keep his eyes closed. He then turned his head towards the three GD masters that were watching him and waved with a smile on his face. Yoda smiled. Nothing to worry about, I feel. Time skip. It was the middle of the night in the GD temple, and most of the residents were asleep to prepare for the next day. All but one resident. But if someone were still around, they would not have noticed this resident moving through the temple, as his stealth skills were of a higher caliber than any of them have seen before. Naruto was making his way through the temple, making sure not to make a sound as he passed the rooms of the masters and students. Okay, if I remember, it should be the next left and a straight shot till I find the opening to the right. He made it to a T section and made the left turn before rushing down the corridor. I still think that it is a bad idea. Why the hell are you doing this in the first place? I agree with Yami on this one. It is very risky with how jumpy these GD are. Do you remember how a lot of them reacted when we tested out if they could sense us? Naruto grimaced at the memory of that testing. Flashback. When he was allowed to wander the temple on his own, he explored the whole building as he wanted to find a place that he could use to test out their theory. The reason that he was doing this was that during one of his personal meditation sessions, he felt something dark coming from within the GD temple. More specifically, underneath it. He didn't know what it was, but Kurama and Yami gave him the theory. They said that it might be a feeling of the dark side of the force. They figured this out because they were with Naruto in his training, and they got a general idea of what the force felt like. And thinking of it, the dark side had a similar feeling, just different. Afterward, they went to the top of the temple where no one was to test this. Naruto made a clone, and he focused on the clone to see if he could feel the force. His clones had the ability to use the force as well, but it was much weaker, so it was set that they would not use the force if they didn't need it. Once Naruto and his clone were set, Yami poked his hand past the bars of the seal, and Naruto felt the same feeling he could feel underneath the temple. This told him that not only was the seal keeping Yami and Kurama hidden from the GD, but that it was the dark side of the force under the temple. They didn't have time to think about it, since they noticed that all of the GD down below were all on alert. Yami made sure to pull back, and Naruto dispelled his clone before he left the area, so that he wouldn't be caught. Flashback end. Naruto shook his head as he shivered at how jumpy the GD were once he made it to more of the public area. He was almost attacked by one of the masters when he turned the corner. He held his hand up and it took a second before the master lowered it. He asked the master what that feeling was, and he was told that it was the dark side of the force. After that, he was told to stay in his room as the whole temple was put on lockdown. It lasted for a week and gave Naruto time to train in his jutsu. Naruto made it to the area he wanted and smiled. Good, no one here. Moving forward, he made a clone and tossed something to it as he and it stood in front of each other. Ready. Ready, boss. They smirked at each other as they started. Elsewhere. Unknown to our favorite blonde, two individuals were arriving at the GD temple. We arrived quite late in the hour. We should remain silent in order to not disturb any of the others. Was one of the individuals whispered words as they walked into the temple entrance and made their way through the hallways. Yes, master. Was the second individual's whispered response. As the two made it deeper, the second individual paused. The first one looked at the second and asked. What is it, Padawan? I'm not sure, but I feel something over there. The first individual looked in the direction the second looked. Perhaps we should investigate it. Are you sure, master? Yes, let us go. The two made their way towards the feeling. Naruto once again watched as his clone dispelled from being hit by the lightsaber he had. He sighed as this was the fifth one. I can get the forms right and I'm learning little by little, but it is somewhat slow if I don't practice with someone who is better at the forms than me. He looked at the saber in his hand and could not help but sigh once again, as the sabers he was using right now were the ones that were in Yoda's training classroom. He used them since they were low-powered and all they left on him were burn marks, so it was the best way to train. The issue was that the lightsabers felt off in his grip. He hoped that when he made his own it would feel better in his hand. I still need to figure out a better way to practice. He made his way to the lightsaber on the ground, but before he could bend down to grab it, it moved to his right and he turned his head to follow it. Oh. As you said before, it is best to practice with someone who knows how to use the forms. Naruto turned off the lightsaber in his hand and bowed. Master, I'm sorry for practicing so late in the night. He stood back up and looked at the ones that caught him. From the skin color, he assumed that both were female Marilyn, with one being the master and the other younger one being the Padawan. The older one nodded as she looked at him. It is not the first time a Padawan was found trying to get some late night practice. But I suppose with how far behind you are, young Uzumaki, you would want as much practice as you could do. Naruto nervously rubbed his head as he knew that his name kinda spread among the GD thanks to his clones in the library, but he still didn't know everyone. I suppose I am well known for what I did, but sorry, I do not know your names. The older one smiled at his behavior as it reminded her of younger children caught red-handed. She then began her introduction. It is a pleasure to formally meet you, Naruto Uzumaki, my name is Luminara Unduli. She then gestured towards her Padawan. The younger Marilyn stepped forward and did a short bow. It is a pleasure to meet you, Naruto Uzumaki, my name is Barisafi. Naruto bowed to the two. Pleasure to meet both of you. I suppose that you are going to tell me to go to my room and wait for my training to continue in the morning. Luminara smiled at him as she looked at the practice lightsaber in her hand. Normally, you should be sent back to your room and disciplined for this. Not to mention that I was informed that you are to train under the supervision of a master, and so far I see no master here. Naruto slumped at this. Next time I gotta make sure I pay attention to my surroundings. I'm ashamed as a shinobi. I can hear Kakashi getting on my case for this. Luminara smiled wider as she spoke. But I understand that you are a sort of special case since you are years behind many here. She looked at her Padawan and held out the practice lightsaber. Thankfully, there is a master here that can supervise your practice. Barris, would you be willing to aid your fellow Padawan? Barris looked at the saber and nodded. Of course, master. She took the practice saber and moved to stand in front of Naruto. Naruto was a little shocked at this as he was sure he would have to continue his practice some other time. But this gave him an excuse to keep going. He looked at the younger Marilyn and could tell that she was a few years older than he was. Though he was guessing since a lot of alien races tend to age at different rates than humans. He bowed at the master before looking back at Barris. Thank you for being my partner in this. It is a pleasure to aid a GD in training. Which form are you wishing to practice? Naruto thought about the forms he needed to work on. Getting an idea, he asked. What form do you primarily use? She smiled as she answered. Form 3, also known as Suresu. Naruto thought about it and responded. The form that Obi-Wan is a master of. I tried it but didn't think it would work for me. But even if I don't think I would use it, I should still practice it. He ignited his lightsaber and took the stance Obi-Wan had shown him. I thank you again for helping me in this. Barris ignited hers and took the same form. The pleasure is all mine. The two faced each other for a second before they began a practice duel under the supervision of Luminara. End chapter. So this part ends here. If you want to see next part of this series, like the video now and share the story with your friends. Bye bye.